Chapter 1. The Quiet Genius of People Who Refuse to Get Lost. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something slow and wide and gently repetitive. If you can dim the lights, let the room go a little blurry around the edges. This is not a story about conquest or shouting or swords. This is about people in canoes, staring at the sky, listening to water, and being very patient about it. You don't need to remember names. You don't need to visualize maps. Just let the ocean do most of the work. We'll drift together. Nothing surprising will happen. And if it does, it will happen very calmly. Polynesian navigation begins, as many good sleepy histories do, with the problem of being extremely far away from everything. The Pacific Ocean is large. Not, wow that's big large. More like, your sense of scale quietly gives up large. It covers a third of the planet. It contains thousands of islands that are, from the perspective of open water, almost offensively small. Some are just thin lines of green. Some are so low that they barely interrupt the horizon. And scattered across this watery expanse were people who decided repeatedly to get into wooden canoes and go find other pieces of land they could not see yet. No compasses, no sextants, no metal instruments, no maps in the way Europeans would later insist were necessary to exist. Just stars, waves, birds, clouds, and a memory trained to hold patterns for a very long time. Which is rude, honestly. They made it look easy. The ancestors of the Polynesians likely began moving eastward from islands Southeast Asia thousands of years ago. This was not a single migration. It was a slow, stubborn process of exploration, settlement, and re-exploration. People sailed. Some stayed. Some went back. Some overshot and adjusted. There was no grand announcement that they were about to people the Pacific. They were just doing what worked. By the time we reach what we call Polynesia proper, these navigators had developed a system that was both deeply technical and deeply human. It was learned by watching, by listening, by sitting quietly for years while someone older corrected you without raising their voice. Navigation was not written down. Of course it wasn't. Writing things down would have made it too easy to forget them. Instead, knowledge lived in chants, stories, gestures, and long nights under the stars. It lived in the body, in posture, in how you sat in a canoe and felt the water move beneath you. This was not mystical in the way people like to romanticize it later. It was practical, painfully practical. If you were wrong, you didn't arrive. And not arriving was inconvenient. Let's start with the stars, because they are polite enough to stay where you leave them. Polynesian navigators learned the night sky as a fixed dome, rotating in predictable ways. They didn't think of stars as points on a map so much as paths and rising places. Each star had a location where it rose on the horizon and where it set. Those points stayed consistent, night after night, season after season. A navigator memorized these rising and setting points as bearings. If you wanted to sail east, you followed stars that rose in the east. If you wanted to keep a steady course, you kept a specific star aligned with the bow of the canoe. When it climbed too high to use, you smoothly switched to another star rising behind it, then another, creating a chain of guidance across the night. This system was often conceptualized as a star compass, not a physical object. Just a mental one. A circle of the horizon divided into named houses, each associated with particular stars. The navigator carried this compass in their head, where it was safe from getting wet. During the day, of course, the stars were gone. This did not cause panic. It caused a change of tools. The sun rose and set in predictable places too, shifting slightly with the seasons. The navigator noted its path, the angle of its climb, the length of shadows. None of this required math. It required familiarity. The kind you only get by paying attention every day for most of your life. And then there were the waves, which is where things get quietly impressive. The open ocean is not a single, uniform surface. It is a conversation between multiple swells generated by winds thousands of miles away. Some swells move steadily in one direction for weeks. Others cross them at angles. Islands interrupt these patterns, bending and reflecting waves long before land is visible. A trained navigator could feel these swells through the hull of the canoe, through their legs, through their spine. They could distinguish one swell from another, track their direction, and notice when something changed. When an island lay ahead, even beyond the horizon, the dominant swell might break into smaller patterns. Reflections would return from unseen shores. The water would feel busy. Not louder, just different. This was called reading the ocean, and it required sitting very still, which is convenient because canoes encourage that. The canoes themselves were masterpieces of quiet engineering, double-hulled vessels, lashed together with fiber, flexible, capable of carrying people, plants, animals, and opinions across enormous distances. They were not rushed. Everything about them suggested a culture that understood waiting. Sails were woven from plant fibers and shaped to work with the wind rather than against it. Steering was subtle. No dramatic turns, just gradual adjustments. The ocean does not reward impatience. Birds help too. Not because they carried messages or anything dramatic like that. Simply because birds have routines. Certain species fly out to sea during the day to feed and return to land at night. If you saw them in the morning flying away from you, that told you something. If you saw them in the evening flying toward you, that told you something else. Clouds were also informative. Clouds form differently over land than over open water. They linger. They pile up. They reflect light. A low island might be invisible, but the cloud above it could be seen from far away. Navigators learn to read these signs without getting excited about them. Excitement leads to mistakes. So does hunger, which was another consideration. Voyages were planned carefully. People brought food that would last. Breadfruit, coconuts, dried fish, sometimes live animals, sometimes cuttings and seeds, because arriving somewhere empty without the means to make it less empty was considered poor planning. There is a tendency in later histories to describe these voyages as accidental, as if people just sort of drifted into Hawaii or Aotearoa by mistake, shrugged, and stayed. This is incorrect, and also a little insulting. These were deliberate expeditions. Planned, repeated. Routes were known. Some islands were visited regularly. Others were sought out intentionally. The distances involved were enormous, but that did not make them random. If anything, the randomness came later when Europeans arrived with maps and promptly got lost while insisting they were doing it properly. But we're not there yet. We're still in the canoe. Navigation knowledge was usually held by specialists, master navigators, people who trained for years under someone older. Training involved memorization, yes, but also something harder to describe. A sense of rhythm, of timing, of when not to act. Mistakes were corrected gently, often indirectly. A teacher might tell a story instead of issuing a command, or sing a chant that encoded a route. The student absorbed it without realizing they were being corrected. This was education designed to be remembered at sea, when panic was unhelpful and shouting was pointless. Routes between islands were memorized as sequences of stars, swells, and signs, not as distances. Distance at sea is a strange concept anyway. What matters is time. How long between this and that? How many nights? How many meals? Some navigators described routes as stories. You leave under this star. You keep that swell on your left. You watch for these birds. You expect this change in the water. And if you don't see it, you wait. Waiting comes up a lot. Let's float gently to the question everyone eventually asks. How did they find islands they had never been to before? Carefully. Exploration voyages involved deliberate searching patterns. Sail out on a bearing. Watch for signs. If nothing appeared, return. Adjust. Try again another season. This could take years, decades, generations. Which means that the discovery of distant places like Easter Island or New Zealand was not a fluke. It was persistence wearing a calm expression. There is something deeply un-European about this approach, which may be why it confused later historians so much. When Europeans finally encountered Polynesian navigators, they were skeptical. Of course they were. European navigation relied on instruments, written charts, and calculations. The idea that someone could cross the Pacific using memory and observation seemed, frankly, impolite. So they assumed luck, or currents, or divine intervention. Anything but expertise. Polynesians, for their part, looked at European ships and noted that they were large, loud, and seemed to involve a lot of shouting. Make of that what you will. Much of traditional navigation knowledge was disrupted by colonization. Routes fell out of use. Languages were suppressed. Training lineages were broken. By the 19th and early 20th centuries, many outsiders confidently declared that the knowledge was lost. It wasn't. It was just quiet. In the 20th century, Polynesian communities began deliberately reviving traditional navigation. Not reconstructing it from scratch, but reawakening what had been preserved in fragments, memories, and practice. One of the most famous examples is the voyaging canoe, launched in Hawaii in the 1970s. Built using traditional design principles. Navigated without instruments. Sailed across the Pacific by people trained in star navigation and ocean reading. And it worked. Calmly. Predictably. As if it always had. This did not surprise the navigators. It surprised everyone else. What's striking about Polynesian navigation is not just that it functioned, but that it fits so neatly into a broader worldview. The ocean was not an enemy to be conquered. It was a space to be understood. A place with patterns. With moods. With rules that could be learned if you were respectful enough. There is very little drama in this story, which is perhaps why it is perfect for sleep. No desperate last stands. No sudden reversals. Just people paying attention over and over again until attention itself became technology. As the canoe moves, the navigator remains mostly still. They are not heroic in the loud sense. They do not pace. They do not give speeches. They feel. They recall. They adjust slightly. They wait for dawn. And eventually, if everything has gone according to plan, a smudge appears on the horizon. Green maybe. Or a cloud that refuses to move. Birds behaving oddly. Water changing its texture. Land does not announce itself. It allows itself to be noticed. Chapter 2. Memorizing the ocean without ever arguing with it. By the time a Polynesian navigator was trusted to guide a long voyage, they had already spent years not going anywhere. This part is often skipped because it sounds boring, which is unfortunate, because boring is where all the competence lives. Training began on land. Not because land was relevant, but because it was stable. A teacher would point at the horizon and name stars that were not yet visible. The student learned where they would rise, where they would set, which ones mattered for which routes. This was done repeatedly, casually, without tests. If you forgot, you were corrected. If you forgot again, you were corrected again. No one panicked. Chants were used, but not in a mystical way. They were memory devices. Lists set to rhythm. The human brain likes rhythm. It remembers rhythm even when tired, hungry, or mildly seasick. Which was helpful. A chant might encode a sequence of stars used to sail between two islands. Another might describe the timing of seasonal winds. Another might quietly remind you not to trust that one bird that always lies. None of this was written down. Writing things down was unnecessary when your entire education assumed you would need to recall it while floating on water with no backup options. Once basic sky knowledge was solid, attention turned to movement. Specifically, how the ocean moved under different conditions. Students learned to sit in a canoe and do very little else. Feel the primary swell. Identify its direction. Then notice the secondary swell crossing it. Then the smaller, local wind waves riding on top. This took time. People are not born knowing how to separate sensations like this. It's learned. Slowly. With repetition. With boredom. Eventually, a student could tell when the swell had shifted direction slightly, even if the wind had not. That mattered. Swells came from distant storms. They were more reliable than surface conditions. If you followed the right one, it would carry you where you needed to go, long after the local weather changed its mind. This ability was sometimes described as sitting on the ocean, which sounds poetic, but mostly meant not fidgeting. Night training was especially important. A navigator had to know the sky so well that they could tell when something was off. A cloud obscuring a star. A star rising earlier than expected. The subtle shift that meant the canoe was drifting off course. Corrections were minimal. Overcorrecting was how you lost the swell entirely. Instead, navigators made small adjustments. Barely visible ones. The canoe responded. Slowly. Everything happened slowly. There was no sense of fighting the environment. The ocean did not care about your plans. You aligned yourself with what was already happening and let it do the heavy lifting. Which brings us to memory. Not just memory of facts, but memory of experience. Routes were remembered as sequences of sensations. This star until midnight. That swell all night. A change in the water just before dawn. Birds appearing on the second morning. Clouds thickening in the afternoon. If something didn't match the remembered pattern, that mattered. It didn't mean disaster. It meant observation. Maybe the season was slightly different. Maybe the wind had shifted. Maybe you needed to wait. Waiting was built into the system. A navigator who panicked because something took longer than expected was not considered skilled. They were considered annoying. Some navigators specialized in particular routes. Others were known for exploration. These individuals were respected, but not mythologized. They were valued because they brought people home. Bringing people home is an underrated skill. As Polynesian societies expanded across the Pacific, networks of exchange developed. Canoes carried goods, people, marriages, news, and arguments between islands. Navigation made this possible. It kept communities connected across distances that would later be described as impossible. It also meant that isolation was rarely total. Even remote islands were part of a larger world. Knowledge traveled. Songs traveled. Genetic diversity traveled, which would later become relevant when Europeans arrived and pretended to be surprised by it. Navigators themselves lived normal lives when not at sea. They had families, responsibilities, preferences. Some were reportedly irritable. Some were patient to the point of being unhelpful. None of them were permanently gazing at the horizon in dramatic silence. When a voyage was planned, the navigator's role was central but understated. They were consulted. They gave opinions. They did not command the crew in a theatrical way. Everyone understood their importance. That was enough. At sea, the navigator's authority was quiet. If they said to adjust course, it happened. If they said to wait, people waited. This was not blind obedience. It was trust built over time. Food and water management was also part of navigation. You had to know how long a journey would take under average conditions. You planned for delays, but not too many. Carrying too much made the canoe sluggish. Carrying too little was worse. This planning required experience, not optimism. Optimism had no place here. Let's drift now to specific places, because abstraction can only stay interesting for so long. Hawaii, for example, sits thousands of miles from the nearest major landmass. Reaching it required sailing north into regions where familiar stars behaved differently. The North Star appeared. Southern constellations dipped lower. Swell patterns shifted. Navigators adapted. They expanded their mental compass. They learned new reference points. They did not complain about it, at least not in ways that survived in oral tradition. New Zealand presented a different challenge. Cooler waters. Different bird species. Different cloud behavior. The land itself was large, which was unusual. Finding it was one thing. Understanding it took generations. Easter Island was perhaps the most demanding target. Isolated. Surrounded by deep ocean. Getting there required precision and commitment. It was not somewhere you casually bumped into, which again suggests intention. Throughout all of this, there was no sense that humans were dominating the ocean. The relationship was closer to cooperation. The navigator did not conquer the sea. They listened to it until it agreed to take them somewhere. This worldview shaped everything else. Social structures emphasized balance. Excessive ambition was frowned upon. A leader who pushed too hard, too fast, was dangerous. Not just politically, but practically. You can't rush a canoe. When Europeans finally began writing about Polynesian navigation in detail, they often framed it as mysterious, as intuitive, as if navigators were guessing correctly over and over again. This framing was comfortable for outsiders because it didn't require them to admit they were witnessing a different, equally valid form of science. But science it was, based on observation, hypothesis, testing, correction, passed down through rigorous training. It just didn't come with paperwork. In later centuries, as traditional navigation declined under colonial pressure, some Polynesian elders deliberately withheld knowledge. Not out of spite, but caution. Teaching navigation required a context that was disappearing. Without the cultural framework, the skills could be misunderstood or misused. This pause would later make revival more difficult, but not impossible, because knowledge that is embodied is hard to erase completely. By the mid-20th century, fragments remained. Star names, chants, stories about routes. A few individuals who still remembered how to feel the swell properly. These fragments waited quietly. When revival efforts began, they did not start with grand claims. They started with canoes, with practice, with people sitting still and paying attention again. And slowly, the old patterns returned. Not perfectly, but well enough, which is usually enough. Chapter 3: Long Routes, Quiet People, and the Art of Not Overshooting an Island. Somewhere in the Pacific, a canoe is already on its way before anyone has decided to make a story out of it. This is important to remember. Voyages did not begin as legends. They began as plans. Practical ones. The kind that involved checking supplies, arguing mildly about timing, and waiting for winds to behave themselves. A long route was not a straight line. It was a relationship between wind, swell, season, and patience. Navigators knew when a route was open, not in a metaphysical sense, in a "the weather will tolerate us" sense. Certain times of year were better for sailing east, others for sailing west. Trade winds were reliable but not generous. You worked with them or you stayed put. Staying put was always an option, which is a theme that comes up again and again. Take the routes between Tahiti and Hawaii. Vast distance. Thousands of miles of open water. No intermediate islands to act as stepping stones. If you missed Hawaii, you did not conveniently bump into something else. You just kept going until supplies became a concern. This meant that navigators did not aim directly at the islands. That would have been risky. Instead, they aimed for a latitude. They sailed north or south until the stars told them they were at the right height, then turned east or west along that line until land appeared. This technique, later called latitude sailing, was not invented by Europeans. It was discovered by people who spent a lot of time watching stars rise and set and noticed that some of them climbed higher in the sky the farther north you went. Again, no equations. Just noticing patterns and trusting them. Routes were taught as narratives. You leave when this wind begins. You follow that star. You expect this many nights. You watch for birds on the fourth day. If you see them earlier, you slow down. If you don't see them at all, you keep going and do not panic. Panicking was not helpful. Panicking burned energy. Energy was needed for paddling, steering, and staying awake. Crews were not large. Everyone had a role. Some steered. Some managed sails. Some watched the horizon. Some handled food and water. The navigator observed everything but interfered as little as possible. If the canoe drifted off course, the navigator corrected it gently. Not immediately. Overcorrection was worse than being slightly wrong for a while. The ocean rewarded smoothness. At night, the navigator tracked the stars in sequence. When one set, another replaced it. This required being awake for long stretches. Not in a dramatic way. In a quiet, stubborn way. Sleep happened in fragments. Short naps. Aphras. The navigator learned to remain oriented even when tired. This was part of training. You did not get a badge for it. You just survived. Daytime navigation relied heavily on the swell. The primary swell usually came from a consistent direction, tied to prevailing winds far away. As long as you could feel it, you could maintain direction even when the sky was empty. If clouds obscured the sun and stars, the swell remained. Patient, reliable, slightly indifferent to your concerns. As the canoe approached land, signs accumulated. Birds appeared more frequently. The swell became confused. Reflected waves bounced back from unseen shores. The watercolor changed subtly. Floating debris became more common. Navigators did not announce these signs excitedly. They noted them. Quietly. There was still time to be wrong. Sometimes land was missed. This happened. Not every voyage succeeded. When that occurred, the canoe returned home, and the route was adjusted for next time. Failure was part of the process. It was not romanticized. It was discussed. Calmly. Over food. Which brings us to the people who made these voyages repeatedly and the toll that took. Navigators aged. Their bodies stiffened. Sitting still for hours became harder. Younger navigators took over gradually. Knowledge was passed along not in a single moment, but in overlap. There was no dramatic, "now you are the master," ceremony. Just a point at which the older navigator said less and the younger one said more. Some navigators became known for particular successes. Reaching a distant island. Opening a new route. Bringing back news of land that would later be settled. Their reputation spread, but not wildly. There were no statues. There were no monuments. Memory was enough. Exploration voyages were often undertaken by small groups. Sometimes they returned. Sometimes they did not. When they did not, their absence was noted without excessive speculation. The ocean was large. It did not explain itself. When new islands were found, they were not always settled immediately. Sometimes they were visited, named, and left alone until conditions were right. This restraint is easy to overlook. It suggests planning across generations. Settlements themselves followed familiar patterns. Plants were introduced. Animals were brought. Land was shaped slowly. The environment was observed before being altered too much. Not because people were saints, but because rushing led to problems. Over time, networks of islands became connected by regular voyages. Marriage partners were exchanged. Alliances were maintained. Disputes were negotiated in person. All of this relied on navigation. Without it, Polynesian societies would have fragmented. With it, they remained part of a shared world. European observers, when they finally took note, struggled to understand how such a system could exist without writing. They assumed someone must be lying, or exaggerating, or relying on supernatural assistance. The idea that long-term memory, careful training, and cultural reinforcement could replace charts was uncomfortable. Later experiments would demonstrate the effectiveness of traditional navigation conclusively. But for centuries, that was unnecessary. The system worked regardless of whether outsiders believed in it, which is perhaps the most restful part of this story. Imagine again the canoe, now closer to land. The air smells different. The swell changes under the hull. The navigator feels this before anyone says anything. They do not rush. There is no finish line. Just arrival. Chapter 4. Songs that were actually instructions and stories that were mostly directions. In Polynesian cultures, stories had a job. They were not entertainment in the modern sense. They were containers. If a story lasted long enough, it could carry something useful across generations without anyone needing to label it as important. Navigation knowledge slipped into these stories quietly. No footnotes. No diagrams. Just repetition. A chant about a hero's journey might also be a route description. The sequence of places visited. The timing of departures. The order in which stars appeared. A listener did not need to be a navigator to memorize it. But if they became one later, the meaning unfolded. This meant that knowledge could hide in plain sight, which is an elegant solution to the problem of forgetting. Songs used rhythm to fix information in the body. You could sing while working, while paddling, while waiting for wind. The melody carried the structure. The words carried the data. If you forgot a line, the rhythm nudged you back. If you forgot the meaning, the route still existed, quietly encoded, waiting to be remembered by someone ready to understand it. Stories about gods and ancestors often doubled as environmental lessons. A deity might travel from island to island, encountering obstacles that mirrored real sailing conditions. A dangerous reef, a tricky wind, a current that pulled the wrong way. To a child, it was just a story. To a navigator, it was a warning. This layered approach meant that navigation knowledge was not restricted to a single group. Even people who never sailed absorbed fragments. They learned the names of stars, the personalities of winds, the habits of birds. When they heard a navigator speak, it was not foreign. It was familiar. The same language, the same metaphors. This cultural saturation made the system resilient. Even when individual experts were lost, the framework remained. Genealogies also played a role. Long lists of names recited at ceremonies did more than establish social rank. They tracked movement, where ancestors came from, how they traveled, which islands were linked. Remembering where your great-grandparents sailed from was not just sentimental. It was geographic information. Time itself was measured relationally, not by numbers but by events. This voyage took as long as it took to sing this many chants, or to cook this many meals, or for this star to complete its path across the sky. This may sound imprecise, but it wasn't. It was tuned to human experience, which made it usable under stress. Navigation was never isolated from daily life. It was part of it. Fishing knowledge overlapped with sailing knowledge. Weather knowledge overlapped with agriculture. Everything connected, which meant that learning to navigate also meant learning restraint. A navigator who tried to impress others by being dramatic was not trusted. Drama implied a lack of control. Control was what you wanted in someone responsible for everyone's survival. This attitude extended to how stories were told. Even tales of great voyages were recounted evenly, without exaggeration, without emotional peaks. If something went wrong, it was mentioned briefly. Then the story moved on. Lingering on mistakes was not useful. This storytelling style can feel flat to modern listeners, which is perfect for sleep. When Europeans eventually recorded Polynesian myths, they often misunderstood them. They separated the religious from the practical, missing how intertwined they were. A god associated with a star was not just symbolic. That star mattered. A spirit tied to a wind was not just a metaphor. That wind arrived on schedule. By reframing these stories as superstition, outsiders stripped them of their instructional value, which made the system seem less rational than it actually was. Within Polynesian societies, however, there was no confusion. A story did not need to declare its purpose. Its usefulness revealed itself through repetition. Children learned these stories long before they learned to sail. By the time they were old enough to train seriously, the patterns were already there. Waiting. Navigation chants were sometimes adjusted subtly over time. A new route discovered. A seasonal shift observed. A star behaving slightly differently than expected. These changes were incorporated gently, not announced, not debated publicly. The chant evolved. The story absorbed it. This flexibility prevented the knowledge from becoming rigid. Rigid systems break when conditions change. Flexible ones drift and adjust, which is exactly what canoes did. Let's consider the emotional lives of navigators for a moment, since this channel enjoys quiet dysfunction. Navigators carried responsibility, but not in a heroic way. If a voyage failed, it reflected on them. But blame was diffuse. Conditions were acknowledged. This meant that navigators did not need to cultivate egos. There was nothing to gain from it. Respect came from reliability, not charisma. Some navigators were reportedly irritable when questioned too much. Others were generous teachers. Both types existed. Neither type was idealized. This is important, because it reminds us that these were people, not archetypes. Their inner lives are mostly lost to us, which is probably fine. What remains is the system they maintained. As colonial pressures intensified, storytelling traditions were disrupted. Languages were suppressed. Ceremonies discouraged. Songs forgotten or altered. Navigation knowledge, embedded in these forms, suffered. But it did not vanish completely. Some stories survived because they were loved, not because they were useful. Ironically, this preserved information no one realized they still had. When revival efforts began, elders revisited these stories with fresh attention. Routes re-emerged. Star names aligned with known positions. Chance matched real distances. The system revealed itself again, like something waking up slowly, which brings a certain calm satisfaction. In the next chapter, we'll look at how this navigation worldview shaped leadership, hierarchy, and the very specific kind of political drama that arises when everyone knows they might need each other to get home. For now, let the songs continue in the background. You don't need to understand the words. They're doing their job anyway. Chapter 5. Calm authority, shared risk, and leaders who knew when to sit down. Polynesian navigation did not exist in a vacuum. It shaped how power worked, how decisions were made, and how leadership looked when shouting was considered unnecessary and slightly embarrassing. This is worth lingering on because it produces a very different kind of political drama. A quieter one. Still human. Still flawed. Just less interested in speeches. Leadership in Polynesian societies was often hereditary, but competence mattered. A great lineage did not excuse poor judgment, especially at sea. If a chief insisted on sailing at the wrong time, people noticed. If that decision went badly, people remembered. Memory was long. Longer than pride. Navigators occupied a strange position. They were not rulers, but they held knowledge that rulers depended on. This created a balance. Chiefs could command, but navigators could advise. And ignoring advice was risky in a very literal sense. This produced a style of leadership that leaned toward consultation. Not democracy, exactly. More like practical listening. Before a voyage, discussions happened quietly. Timing was debated. Winds were considered. The navigator's opinion carried weight, but it was not absolute. Social factors mattered too. Alliances. Obligations. The need to visit relatives or reinforce claims. Once at sea, however, hierarchy flattened slightly. The navigator's authority over direction was rarely questioned. Not because of status, but because survival was not a place for experimentation. This separation of roles helped keep everyone calm. You knew who was responsible for what. You didn't interfere unless something was clearly wrong. And even then, you probably phrased it gently. This atmosphere extended beyond the canoe. In island politics, patience was valued. A leader who rushed decisions risked destabilizing relationships that took generations to build. This did not eliminate conflict. It just changed its tempo. Disputes between islands existed. Rivalries flared. But warfare was not constant, and diplomacy mattered. Navigation made diplomacy possible. You could visit. You could talk. You could leave. Leaving is underrated. The knowledge that people could move between islands reduced isolation. Isolation tends to breed paranoia. Connectivity breeds negotiation. Even if it's awkward negotiation, navigators facilitated this by making travel predictable. You knew when visitors might arrive. You knew when to expect return voyages. This regularity supported social order. It also created expectations. If someone failed to arrive when they should have, concern spread. But not immediately. Weather happened. Delays happened. Panic waited its turn. This restraint is noticeable when compared to later European maritime cultures, where missing ships were often assumed lost within weeks. Polynesian communities were accustomed to uncertainty and had systems to tolerate it, which is another way of saying they were good at waiting. Leadership also involved ritual responsibility. Chiefs were tied to land and ancestry. Navigators were tied to movement. These roles complemented each other. A chief without navigators was isolated. A navigator without community was pointless. Neither functioned alone. This interdependence limited extremes of power. A leader who abused authority risked losing cooperation. People might still obey, but enthusiasm would fade. And enthusiasm mattered when you needed people to paddle for days. Social pressure replaced overt coercion in many cases. Reputation mattered. A lot. Navigators themselves were judged by consistency, not brilliance. A single impressive voyage did not outweigh years of reliability. This discouraged recklessness. Recklessness, again, was frowned upon. When new lands were settled, leadership structures adapted. Founding groups often included people from different islands. different lineages, different habits. This required compromise. No one arrived alone. Even exploration parties carried a mix of backgrounds. The resulting communities reflected this diversity. Navigation enabled this blending. It prevented insularity. It allowed ideas to circulate. Agricultural techniques, fishing methods, social customs, which meant that Polynesian cultures, spread across vast distances, retained striking similarities while also developing local variations. This balance is hard to achieve. It requires movement without chaos, stability without stagnation. Navigation provided that framework. Let's look briefly at what happened when navigation knowledge was ignored or diminished. Not dramatically, just quietly. In periods where inter-island voyaging declined, due to environmental shifts, population pressures, or social change, communities became more inward-focused. Innovation slowed. Resource stress increased. This was not immediate collapse. It was subtle, a narrowing of horizons, literally and figuratively. When navigation revived, even partially, connections reopened. Trade resumed. Marriages expanded networks again. Tensions eased. Movement was medicine. European arrival disrupted this system in ways that were not immediately obvious. New ships appeared, new trade goods, new diseases, new power dynamics. European navigators assumed control of long-distance travel, often sidelining traditional navigators. Indigenous expertise was dismissed as primitive or unnecessary. This undermined the social balance. Chiefs no longer needed local navigators to travel. Authority shifted. Knowledge pathways broke. Navigation stopped being a shared cultural foundation and became a specialized, external service. This had consequences. Without regular voyaging, inter-island relationships weakened. Oral knowledge tied to routes faded faster. Songs lost relevance. Stories became harder to interpret. Communities adapted as they always did. But something quiet was lost. It's tempting to frame this as tragedy, but that adds unnecessary drama. It was more like neglect. So, unremarkable. The kind of loss that doesn't announce itself. Which makes revival later feel almost miraculous, though it wasn't. It was work. In the 20th century, when Polynesian communities began reclaiming navigation, they weren't just reviving a technique. They were restoring a way of organizing society around shared skill and trust. Voyaging canoes became symbols, yes, but also classrooms, political statements, proof that old systems were not inferior, just interrupted. Young navigators trained again. Elders taught again. Songs were sung with renewed attention. This affected leadership too. Cultural confidence shifted. People remembered that their ancestors had crossed oceans deliberately, competently, and repeatedly. That memory changed how communities saw themselves. Which brings us back to the human scale of all this. Imagine a navigator advising a chief, calmly, without theatrics, explaining that the wind is not right yet, suggesting they wait another month. The chief listens, maybe reluctantly, maybe thoughtfully. The decision is made. People wait. Nothing happens for weeks. And then, quietly, everything continues. This is not exciting history, which is exactly why it works so well. Chapter 6, when outsiders announced the end, and the ocean politely ignored them. By the time Europeans began arriving in Polynesian waters in greater numbers, traditional navigation had already been doing its job for centuries. Quietly, reliably, without asking for recognition, which made it easy to underestimate. European ships arrived with flags, paperwork, and a great deal of confidence. They also arrived with maps that were sometimes wrong, chronometers that broke, and crews who argued loudly about who was at fault. This contrast went mostly unremarked upon by the people watching from shore. At first, traditional navigators were still used. European captains occasionally relied on local pilots to guide them through reefs or between islands. These pilots were respected in a narrow, utilitarian way. They were helpful. They were not considered intellectual equals. This distinction mattered. As colonial administrations expanded, European navigation methods were formalized as the only legitimate ones. Charts replaced memory. Instruments replaced observation. Written logs replaced chance. Traditional navigation was not banned outright. It was simply made irrelevant. Young people were encouraged, sometimes forced, to learn European languages and skills. Sailing in traditional canoes was reframed as backward, dangerous, unnecessary. And because colonial systems controlled resources, education, and travel, they were believed. Voyaging declined. Not immediately, but steadily. Routes fell quiet. Canoes aged and were not replaced. Master navigators died without training successors fully. Not because they were careless, but because the context for teaching had eroded. Teaching navigation required time, trust, and repeated voyages. Colonial economies did not reward this. They rewarded speed, efficiency, compliance, which is ironic given how inefficient European ships often were in Pacific conditions. As decades passed, scholars began declaring Polynesian navigation extinct. They did this confidently, based on limited observation, and a deep belief that if something did not look like Western science, it could not persist. These declarations were written in books. Books are persuasive. Polynesian communities, meanwhile, continued to fish, to travel short distances, to read the sea in everyday ways. Much of the foundational knowledge never disappeared. It simply stopped being applied at long range. This distinction was lost on outsiders. By the early 20th century, the narrative had settled. Polynesians were said to have drifted accidentally across the Pacific in the distant past, guided by luck or currents, and then somehow forgotten how they did it. This narrative was comforting. It implied inevitability. It removed agency. It was also wrong. Fragments of navigation knowledge persisted in unexpected places. In lullabies. In ceremonial chants. In the way elders described weather. In the names of stars still used in daily speech. Some elders remembered more. They just weren't asked. When they were asked, they were sometimes dismissed. Their knowledge did not come with diagrams, or numbers, or footnotes. It came with stories, and pauses, and assumptions that the listener already understood certain things. Most listeners did not. This mismatch created silence. It wasn't until the mid-20th century that a small number of people, both Polynesian and not, began to question the extinction narrative seriously. They noticed inconsistencies. They noticed that island distribution patterns did not match random drift. They noticed that oral traditions contained navigational logic if you listened carefully enough. Listening carefully was not a common academic skill at the time. One of the turning points came when researchers realized that traditional navigators were still alive in parts of Micronesia, particularly among the Carolinian navigators of Satawal. These navigators had maintained long-distance voyaging knowledge with fewer interruptions. They were not hidden. They were simply ignored. When contact was made and learning began, it became clear that traditional navigation was not guesswork. It was a complete system, coherent, teachable, repeatable. This realization caused discomfort. If Polynesian navigation was real, then centuries of dismissal had been unnecessary. Worse, they had been wrong. This discomfort slowed acceptance. But knowledge, once demonstrated, has a habit of resurfacing. As Polynesian communities began reclaiming cultural practices more broadly, navigation re-emerged as a powerful symbol. Not because it was flashy, but because it was undeniable. You cannot fake crossing an ocean without instruments. Either you arrive or you don't. And people arrived. The revival was not instant. It required rebuilding canoes, recovering terminology, training new navigators from the ground up. This took patience, which, fortunately, had always been part of the tradition. Elders collaborated. Knowledge was compared. Star names aligned across islands. Differences were noted, not argued over. The system flexed as it always had. When the first revival voyages succeeded, they were celebrated quietly. There was pride, but also relief. The knowledge still worked. Of course it did. European observers watching these voyages often reacted with surprise. which says more about them than about the navigators. The ocean had never changed its rules. It had just been waiting. Chapter 7. Revival without spectacle and the strange discipline of proving nothing. The revival of Polynesian navigation did not arrive with a manifesto. There were no dramatic announcements that something ancient had returned to correct the modern world. That would have been off-brand. Instead, it began with conversations, with people asking elders what they remembered, with disagreements that stayed polite, with long pauses where no one rushed to fill the silence. This is worth emphasizing because most revival movements enjoy noise. This one preferred accuracy. In Hawaii, the Polynesian Voyaging Society formed in the early 1970s with a goal that was simple and oddly ambitious. Build a traditional double-hulled canoe. Sail it without modern instruments. Prove that intentional voyaging across the Pacific was possible. Not symbolically possible. Actually possible. The canoe was named Hkli after the star Arcturus, which passes directly overhead in Hawaii and was used as a zenith star by navigators. This was not poetic branding. It was practical. The canoe itself was built using modern materials where necessary, but traditional design principles guided its shape and balance. This was not about reenactment purity. It was about function. Early on, there was uncertainty. Not philosophical uncertainty. Technical uncertainty. Who still knew enough to navigate? Who could teach? What knowledge had been lost, and what was simply dormant? The answer turned out to be inconvenient for simple narratives. Some knowledge was fragmented. Some was intact. Some had shifted shape. Training began anyway. Navigators learned to observe again. Not because observation was new, but because it had been undervalued. Sitting still was reframed as work. Feeling the canoe move became data. The first major voyage in 1976 sailed from Hawaii to Tahiti. Over 2,500 miles. No compass, no GPS, no sextant. The navigator, Malpielug of Satawal, had been trained in a Micronesian navigation tradition that had remained more continuous. He did not present himself as a savior. He presented himself as a teacher. He taught by example, by correction, by silence. When the canoe arrived in Tahiti, it did not arrive triumphantly. It arrived correctly. Which was the point. The success of the voyage forced a re-evaluation. Not immediately, but steadily. Skeptics shifted their objections. Some suggested the success was a fluke. Others argued that modern materials made the difference. Still others quietly stopped commenting. The ocean, again, did not participate in the debate. Training programs expanded. Young navigators learned star paths, swell patterns, cloud reading. The work was slow. Mistakes were expected. One navigator described learning as being wrong very calmly until you aren't. This captures the tone well. What's notable is what the revival did not emphasize. It did not frame navigation as mystical. It did not claim superiority over modern methods. It did not reject technology outright. Instead, it insisted on relevance. Traditional navigation was not brought back to replace GPS. It was brought back to restore confidence, to reconnect people to environment and ancestry in a way that did not require nostalgia. This distinction mattered. As more voyages succeeded, Hkli became a traveling classroom. It visited islands across Polynesia. It carried elders, students, activists, scientists. Each voyage reinforced the same lesson. This knowledge still worked. It had always worked. Navigators trained in the revival tradition did not claim to be identical to their ancestors. They acknowledged gaps. They adapted. They consulted multiple traditions. This flexibility prevented the movement from becoming rigid or ideological. Some navigators combined traditional methods with modern safety equipment. Others insisted on stricter adherence. Both approaches existed. Neither was treated as heresy. The emphasis remained on competence, not purity. Cultural impact spread beyond navigation. Language revitalization gained momentum. Star names were taught again. Seasonal cycles regained meaning. People began to notice environmental changes more acutely. Swell behavior, wind patterns, Bird migration shifts. Climate change became personal, not abstract. Navigation encouraged this awareness. You cannot read the ocean without noticing when it behaves differently than it used to. This awareness fed into broader movements around environmental stewardship. Not dramatically, practically. If the ocean was a partner, not a resource, abuse made no sense. Which brings us to the emotional undercurrent of the revival. For many participants, this was not about pride. It was about repair. Repairing a narrative that had told them their ancestors had drifted accidentally into history. Proving intention mattered. But even here, restraint prevailed. There was no need to shout about it. The canoe had already said enough. Public interest grew. Media attention followed. Documentaries were made. Articles written. This attention was handled carefully. Navigators avoided becoming celebrities. The focus stayed on the voyage, not the individuals. This was not false humility. It was structural. Navigation does not work if attention shifts too far inward. Egos capsize boats. As the revival matured, long-distance voyages expanded further. Hkli sailed to Aotearoa, to Rapa Nui, to the west coast of North America. Each voyage followed the same pattern. Preparation, waiting, sailing, observation, arrival. No shortcuts. No dramatization. Failures happened too. Misjudgments, weather surprises, equipment issues. These were discussed openly, not hidden, not embellished, which reinforced trust. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the revival is how little it tried to convince anyone. It simply continued. Over time, skepticism faded not because it was defeated, but because it became irrelevant. Traditional navigation did not need validation from outside systems. It functioned on its own terms. This is an uncomfortable outcome for academic arguments, but a soothing one for bedtime history. Imagine a young navigator today, training under this revived system. They learn stars that have been rising for millennia. They sit in canoes shaped by ancestral logic. They feel swells generated by storms thousands of miles away. They also check weather forecasts sometimes. They use radios when needed. They live in the modern world. This coexistence is not contradictory. It is adaptive. Navigation has always adapted. Chapter 8. What remains when nothing needs to be proven anymore. At some point, the canoe stops being a statement and becomes a routine. This is usually where traditions are healthiest. When they no longer need defending. When they no longer require explanation. Polynesian navigation, in its revived form, has reached something like this stage. It exists. It is practiced. It is taught. Not constantly. Not everywhere. But enough. Which is all it ever needed. Modern navigators trained in traditional methods do not spend much time arguing about legitimacy. They are too busy paying attention. To wind shifts. To seasonal changes. To how the ocean behaves now, as opposed to how it behaved when their teachers were young. This attentiveness has become increasingly relevant. The Pacific is changing. Swell patterns are shifting. Weather systems are less predictable. Bird migrations are altered. Islands experience erosion and rising seas. Traditional navigation, built on long-term observation, notices these changes quickly. It does not solve them, but it registers them. Calmly. Precisely. In this way, the tradition continues its original function. Not as nostalgia. As awareness. There is something quietly radical about a system of knowledge that values waiting over rushing. Memory over documentation. Relationship over domination. It does not scale well. It was never meant to. Navigation knowledge is taught person to person. In canoes. Over time. This limits its spread, but preserves its depth. You cannot download it. This frustrates institutions. Which is not necessarily a problem. Educational programs inspired by traditional navigation have appeared across Polynesia and beyond. They teach students to read stars, to understand currents, to see environment as interconnected. These programs often report the same result. Students slow down. They listen better. They argue less loudly. No one claims causation. They simply notice correlation. The navigators themselves remain understated figures. They are not celebrities. They are not prophets. They are practitioners. When asked to explain what they do, many struggle. Not because it is mysterious, but because it is embodied. You can describe stars. You can describe swells. But the integration of it all lives somewhere beyond words, which is why it survived in songs and stories for so long, and why it resists being fully captured in textbooks. This resistance is sometimes framed as loss, as something missing, but it can also be seen as protection. Knowledge that cannot be fully extracted cannot be easily erased. The ocean, in this story, remains unchanged. It does not care about revival narratives. It does not reward ideology. It responds to attention and humility as it always has. Polynesian navigators did not see themselves as mastering the ocean. They saw themselves as participating in it. This perspective has aged well. As modern societies grapple with environmental uncertainty, the navigation tradition offers no quick fixes. It offers something slower, an ethic. Pay attention. Do not rush. Adjust gently. Wait when necessary. Share responsibility. Remember what worked. These are not dramatic lessons, which makes them easy to overlook. They are also difficult to monetize, which explains some things. The tradition's greatest success may be its refusal to become a product. Voyaging canoes exist, but they are not theme parks. Training exists, but it is not mass-produced. There are no shortcuts to competence. This is not a bug. It is the design. In this sense, Polynesian navigation remains deeply boring and deeply impressive. Imagine one last time the navigator sitting in the canoe. The stars above are familiar. The swell beneath is steady. The horizon is empty, and that is fine. They are not searching for land aggressively. They know where they are going. They know when to wait. They know when to trust what they feel. They do not narrate their thoughts. They do not need to. And perhaps that is the most restful part of this entire history. Nothing needs to be conquered. Nothing needs to be optimized. Nothing needs to be proven again. The canoe moves. The ocean responds. The stars continue their long, reliable arcs. And if you have drifted off somewhere along the way, that's perfectly appropriate. The tradition would approve. Chapter 9. The quiet persistence of knowledge across generations. Even after centuries of disruption, suppression, and misrepresentation, the knowledge of Polynesian navigation persists. Not as a spectacle. Not as a headline. Not as a conveniently packaged story for outsiders to admire. It persists quietly, stubbornly, in ways that are easy to overlook if you're not paying attention. Families still remember star names. Swells still whisper their directions to those who can feel them. Songs and chants are still passed down. Sometimes, the meanings are forgotten. Sometimes, they are remembered perfectly. Both are valuable. Both are part of the continuity. What is remarkable about this persistence is that it does not require external validation. European cartographers once declared Polynesian navigation primitive. Scholars once assumed it had been lost. Newspapers once framed long voyages as lucky accidents. And yet, the knowledge endured. Not because anyone believed in it, but because it worked. The system's strength is in its quietness. It survives through repeated practice, through patient teaching, through the simple fact that it is needed. When the winds shift or the swells roll, there is no substitute for embodied experience. There is no shortcut through memory, attention, or calm observation. This quiet persistence has an emotional component as well. Generations of navigators have understood that the ocean does not care about ego, status, or stories. The stars do not rise differently for anyone's benefit. The swell continues, unbothered by human concerns. Success depends on humility, discipline, and patience. These traits have been cultivated in every navigator who learned from an elder, who repeated chants until they could feel the rhythm, who waited calmly for the right time to depart. Communities, too, participate in this persistence. Voyaging is rarely an individual endeavor. It is social. It is relational. It depends on trust and cooperation. A navigator may know the stars, but the crew keeps the canoe steady, maintains supplies, watches the horizon, and paddles in rhythm. Knowledge is reinforced socially, not just intellectually. Even when external forces, colonization, missionaries, globalization, interrupted these practices, the social and cultural scaffolding ensured that fragments survived. Stories retained encoded directions. Genealogies retained place references. Skills were preserved, even if dormant. When the conditions became favorable again, knowledge did not have to be reinvented. It simply re-emerged. This persistence is almost imperceptible if you are looking for drama. There are no triumphant speeches. There are no medals. There is no flashy victory parade. Instead, there are generations quietly observing the same stars, feeling the same swells, remembering the same chants, and passing them on to the next generation. This is why the revival of Polynesian navigation in the 20th century was so effective. It did not need to create knowledge. It merely needed to reactivate what had never truly disappeared. The ocean, the stars, the chants, the swells, they were waiting. The people remembered, and that was enough. Even today, the system remains living. Navigators are trained through practice, not just theory. Voyages are still undertaken without instruments, but with awareness honed over centuries. Observations continue to be tested against reality. Small adjustments are made. Mistakes are quietly noted and corrected. Knowledge continues to evolve, but slowly, deliberately, and without fanfare. The lesson here is not about conquest, genius, or drama. It is about durability, humility, and attentiveness. Knowledge that is embedded in practice, experience, and relationships has a way of surviving even when everything else seems to be lost. It may lie dormant for decades or centuries, but as long as someone remembers the rhythm of a chant, the pattern of stars, or the feel of a swell, it persists. As we drift toward the conclusion of this narrative, it is worth imagining that continuity. The canoe glides across the night ocean. The navigator is quiet. The crew paddles. Stars arc across the sky. Swells rock gently beneath. The knowledge of generations is alive in every motion, every observation, every moment of stillness. Chapter 10: Continuity, Identity, and Listening to the World as It Is. By now, it is clear that Polynesian navigation is not just a set of techniques. It is a way of seeing, feeling, and participating in the world. And this perspective continues to shape modern identity in ways that are subtle, pervasive, and often underappreciated. For Polynesian communities today, the revival of navigation has become a cultural anchor. It reminds people that their ancestors moved deliberately, intelligently, and repeatedly across vast stretches of ocean. That knowledge was never accidental. Voyaging was never luck. And yet, the emphasis is not on pride or performance. It is on participation, discipline, and observation. Learning to navigate reinforces a connection to ancestry. Not in a theatrical sense. Not by idolizing the past, but by embedding oneself in the same rhythms and attentiveness that guided earlier generations. Each voyage, each chant, each observation of swell or star acts as a quiet thread linking the past to the present. This continuity shapes personal and communal identity. Students in revival programs report a sense of grounding, a sense of belonging, not because they are doing something heroic, but because they are doing something persistent, something that has survived centuries of interruption, something that, in its quiet way, defies disappearance. Environmental awareness is another product of this continuity. Navigators notice small changes, a swell that behaves differently, a star that rises slightly out of expected position, birds appearing in unusual patterns. These observations are subtle, almost imperceptible, but over time, they build a detailed, experiential understanding of the natural world. In a modern context, this sensitivity is invaluable. It encourages listening rather than acting hastily. It emphasizes patience, calibration, and attention to small deviations. It teaches that the environment is not an obstacle to overcome but a partner to understand. Community engagement also benefits. Voyaging is collaborative. Students, elders, and mentors all share responsibility. Roles are distributed. Trust is developed slowly. Mistakes are corrected quietly. Success is measured in completion, not applause. Leadership is tested in patience, not authority. These principles carry beyond navigation. They inform education, conflict resolution, and social cohesion. People learn to value listening, humility, and shared responsibility. They experience firsthand that expertise is not flashy. It is sustained, patient, and reliable. Modern navigators sometimes combine traditional techniques with contemporary tools, radios, GPS, and weather forecasts. But these aids are supplemental. The core of navigation remains the same: observation, memory, and attention to subtle cues. The tradition persists not because it rejects modernity, but because it is adaptable. Adaptability, in this case, is quiet resilience. The same trait that allowed knowledge to survive colonization, cultural suppression, and global disruption now allows it to flourish in a modern world. It continues to function. It continues to teach. It continues to connect. The revival voyages themselves continue to be understated. There are celebrations, yes, but they are calm. Pride is tempered by patience. Accomplishment is measured in completed journeys, not spectacle. And each voyage reinforces the principle that knowing, observing, and moving deliberately is its own reward. For observers, there is an almost hypnotic beauty in this rhythm. Canoes glide across water. Stars mark progress. Swells carry the vessel. Every action is purposeful, restrained, and deliberate. Noise and drama are unnecessary. They would only interfere with attention. Ultimately, Polynesian navigation teaches more than voyaging. It teaches a way of being in the world, a way of learning, a way of remembering, a way of trusting processes that are slow, patient, and continuous. It emphasizes that knowledge does not always need to be loud to be enduring. As this chapter winds down, imagine the canoe at dawn. The navigator scans the horizon. Swells move predictably. Stars retreat to daylight. Birds appear in small flocks. The crew paddles steadily, rhythmically. Knowledge is alive, practiced, and transmitted without fanfare. And somewhere beneath the surface of history, that knowledge has never stopped. It waits quietly, patiently, enduring. Not to impress anyone, not to prove anything, simply because it works, and has always worked. Chapter 11: Understated Expertise and the Lessons that Travel Quietly. If there is one overarching lesson to take from Polynesian navigation, it is that mastery does not need to be loud. It does not require spectacle. It does not demand immediate recognition. It survives and even thrives in patience, attention, and repetition. This is the principle that carried traditional navigation across centuries, through interruption and suppression, into revival. Navigators teach us that expertise is embodied. It is not simply memorized or documented. It is felt, observed, and integrated. Sitting quietly in a canoe, noticing subtle shifts in swell or wind, observing star positions over months and years, these are practices that cultivate knowledge more reliably than any textbook. Patience is central. Voyaging is slow. Adjustments are gradual. Decisions are weighed against observation and experience rather than impulse. When mistakes occur, they are corrected quietly and without dramatization. This approach extends beyond navigation. It models a way of living where careful attention is valued over flash or immediacy. Collaboration is equally important. Navigation is not a solitary achievement. It is social. The crew, the community, the elders, all contribute. The navigator observes, guides, and integrates, but the journey depends on shared responsibility. Trust, reliability, and collective focus are as critical as individual skill. This teaches humility. The ocean does not respond to ego. The stars do not bend for pride. Knowledge survives because it is aligned with the world, not because it demands attention or applause. Practicing this knowledge shapes character. It encourages listening, observation, and modesty, skills that are increasingly rare in a noisy, rapid world. Revival demonstrates resilience. Even after disruption, the system adapts. It incorporates new learners, shifts in environment, and some modern tools, without losing its essence. Knowledge is not static. It flexes. It survives because it is practical, tested, and embodied. There is also a subtle lesson about history itself. Outsiders often misinterpret traditions they do not understand. Polynesian navigation was dismissed as primitive or accidental for centuries. Scholars, colonizers, and travelers framed it as myth or superstition. Yet, when observed with attention and care, it revealed itself as precise, repeatable, and rational. Sometimes, the quiet persistence of expertise is the most radical lesson of all. In a contemporary context, this knowledge continues to offer insights. Environmental awareness, slow decision-making, and deep observation are crucial for adapting to change. Patience, humility, and careful collaboration remain essential. The ocean, in this case, becomes a metaphor. Attention and alignment matter more than force or hurry. Imagine the canoe again at dawn, the horizon broad and empty, the swell steady beneath the hull. The navigator scans the stars retreating with the sunlight, the crew paddles in calm rhythm, and the knowledge of generations moves with them. There is no rush, no need for applause. The work itself is sufficient. And perhaps this is the ultimate lesson. The most extraordinary achievements are not always dramatic. Some of the most enduring systems of knowledge are quiet, patient, and unassuming. They persist because they work, not because anyone has to notice. They teach humility, observation, and the value of sustained attention, lessons that apply on water, on land, and in the everyday challenges of life. The canoe continues. The ocean continues. The stars continue. And the knowledge that guided countless voyagers across thousands of miles continues, quietly, steadily, and unassumingly, waiting only for those willing to observe, listen, and participate. Chapter 12. Integrating Tradition into Modern Life. In contemporary Polynesian communities, navigation is no longer solely about crossing oceans. It has become a lens through which daily life, education, and cultural identity are shaped. The revival of voyaging practices carries lessons beyond the canoe, offering a rhythm, perspective, and ethic that influence both individuals and communities. Schools and cultural programs incorporate traditional navigation into curricula. Children learn star names, the behavior of swells, cloud patterns, and wind directions alongside conventional subjects. But this learning is not abstract. It is practice-based. Students sing chants, observe the ocean, and paddle small vessels. These exercises cultivate attention, patience, and observation, skills that extend naturally into other areas of life. Families also participate. Voyaging is a community activity, connecting elders, youth, and adults. Elders share knowledge, often without dramatization, emphasizing experience over theory. Young people internalize rhythms and observations that textbooks cannot teach. Social bonds are strengthened. Responsibility is shared. Decision-making is practiced calmly and deliberately. Modern navigators sometimes blend traditional techniques with contemporary tools. GPS and weather forecasts are used for safety, but core navigation relies on stars, swells, and environmental observation. This combination illustrates adaptability. The tradition does not reject modernity. It integrates it while maintaining the practices that have survived centuries. The influence extends to environmental awareness. Navigators notice small variations in currents, swells, and animal behavior. This sensitivity translates to broader ecological understanding, fostering stewardship of marine and island environments. Observation becomes both a practical skill and an ethical responsibility. Cultural identity is strengthened through this practice. Communities remember that their ancestors intentionally traversed vast distances with knowledge, not luck. This perspective fosters pride, but quietly. Emphasis is on participation, not performance. Mastery is measured by competence and attentiveness, not recognition. Even in urban settings, the principles of navigation shape values and habits. Patience, observation, collaboration, and calm decision-making are emphasized. Leadership is understood as relational rather than hierarchical. Mistakes are acknowledged and corrected without drama. These traits, nurtured by engagement with traditional navigation, reinforce both personal and social stability. Voyaging also preserves language, mythology, and cultural practices. Chants and stories carry encoded knowledge, keeping linguistic and symbolic systems alive. Students and navigators internalize these stories, bridging practical skill with cultural heritage. Knowledge is simultaneously technical, social, and symbolic. In sum, modern Polynesian navigation demonstrates that traditional expertise is not only resilient but deeply integrative. It connects past, present, and future. It combines technical skill, social cohesion, environmental awareness, and cultural continuity. It is quiet, patient, and understated. And yet, it remains profoundly effective. As the sun rises over a calm ocean, imagine a canoe moving steadily through gentle swells. The navigator observes stars fading in the dawn light. The crew paddles rhythmically. Knowledge, community, and identity continue to flow together. Nothing is rushed. Nothing needs Chapter 13, retracing ancestral routes and connecting islands. Modern Polynesian voyaging does more than preserve knowledge. It actively reconnects islands and communities across vast distances. These journeys retrace routes first traveled centuries ago, reminding participants that the Pacific is a network of relationships, not isolated points of land. Voyages are carefully planned. They follow the principles of traditional navigation, reading stars, interpreting swells, observing clouds, and noting wildlife. Yet, unlike earlier times, crews often combine these observations with modern safety tools. The emphasis remains on traditional methods, but contemporary aids reduce risk, allowing learning to proceed uninterrupted. Each voyage is both literal and symbolic. The canoe moves through water, but it also moves through memory. Every paddle stroke echoes the journeys of ancestors. Every star sighted, every swell felt, is a lesson in attentiveness, patience, and humility. Success is measured not by speed but by correctness and care. One notable route retraces the path between Hawaii and Tahiti. This distance is roughly 2,500 miles of open ocean. Even with modern vessels, the journey requires sustained attention. Crews must read subtle cues, the way waves interact, cloud patterns, flight paths of birds, and the behavior of the sun and stars. Arrival is quiet, deliberate, and relational. Islanders are greeted not with fanfare, but with recognition of shared history and cooperation. The voyage reaffirms inter-island bonds. Families, communities, and cultural practices are connected across distance, preserving relationships that predate modern borders. These journeys reinforce collective memory. Knowledge of routes, timing, and environmental cues is passed from navigators to crew members. Younger generations absorb not only technique but philosophy, attention, patience, humility, and responsibility. Mistakes are corrected calmly, lessons are internalized slowly. The journeys also maintain continuity of ecological observation. Navigators note changes in ocean behavior, bird migration, and coastal conditions. This information supplements historical understanding and contributes to contemporary awareness of environmental change. Observation is embedded in action, and action reinforces knowledge. Voyaging strengthens identity. Participants come to understand themselves as inheritors of a living tradition. Competence in navigation is not vanity, it is continuity. Each completed voyage confirms the effectiveness of ancient knowledge and embeds it in modern life. Cultural pride is present, but understated. These are not ceremonial pageants. Voyages focus on practice, learning, and participation. Elders guide. Students learn. Communities support. Knowledge, like the ocean, flows steadily, quietly, and reliably. Importantly, voyages also demonstrate resilience. Weather, equipment, and human error always present challenges. Success depends on preparation, observation, and collaboration. No single person can claim mastery alone. Knowledge is distributed, embodied, and relational. This distributed expertise mirrors historical reality. Ancient Polynesian voyaging was never solitary. Communities and networks were essential for survival, resource sharing, and knowledge transmission. Modern voyages reinforce this principle, highlighting that connection across islands is both practical and cultural. The cumulative effect of retracing ancestral routes is subtle but powerful. Navigation is strengthened. Communities are reminded of interdependence. Environmental awareness is sharpened. Cultural identity is grounded in both history and practice. As the canoe glides toward its destination, every element, swells, stars, clouds, paddler's rhythm, reaffirms a system that has endured through centuries of quiet persistence. Arrival is not dramatic. It is a confirmation of continuity, knowledge working, relationships maintained, identity preserved. Chapter 13, Expanded Retracing Ancestral Routes and Connecting Islands. Modern Polynesian voyaging is a deliberate act of remembering. Each voyage retraces routes that were first traveled centuries, sometimes millennia, ago. This is not merely symbolic. It is a way of making history tangible, of testing whether the knowledge passed down through generations still functions in practice. And remarkably, it does. Consider a voyage from Hawaii to Tahiti. Over 2,500 miles of open ocean, there is nothing to see except sky and water for most of the journey. Modern navigators prepare meticulously, but the journey is never fully predictable. Clouds shift, swells vary, birds appear unexpectedly. Each observation matters. The navigator must integrate all of these cues in real time. During one such voyage, a crew reported that the usual swell pattern had shifted slightly due to a seasonal current change. Inexperienced paddlers might have panicked or questioned the navigator's plan, but the team remained calm. Observations were logged, predictions adjusted, and the canoe maintained its course. By the end, the subtle variation was not only managed but memorized for future voyages. This is how knowledge accumulates quietly. Arrival in Tahiti is understated. There are no triumphant parades, no speeches. The crew is welcomed with recognition of their effort and their care, not spectacle. Elders greet them, reminding the new generation of ancestral connections. Families and communities are linked again. This reinforcement of social bonds across islands is as important as the navigation itself. Voyages also allow for intergenerational teaching. Elders recall star paths, wind patterns, and ocean cues. Young crew members practice observation and decision-making, internalizing knowledge in ways that books cannot convey. Mistakes are expected. Corrections are quiet. Patience is taught by example rather than instruction. This method preserves the embodied knowledge that is central to Polynesian navigation. Bird behavior is one particularly important observation. Certain species indicate nearby land, others signal prevailing winds or currents. Crews watch carefully for these signs. During one voyage, the sudden appearance of frigate birds prompted navigators to adjust course slightly, confirming the proximity of an island before it appeared on the horizon. These small, quiet adjustments exemplify the intimate relationship navigators have with their environment. Cloud formations provide another source of information. Certain clouds form consistently over islands or indicate specific wind conditions. Navigators track these patterns over days and nights. One account describes a crew noting subtle differences in cloud color at dawn and dusk, correlating them with wind shifts over the previous week. This continuous attention turns observation into intuition over time. Voyaging is also a form of cultural reinforcement. Crew members recite chants, tell stories, and remember genealogies as they paddle. These stories carry encoded knowledge, directions, timing, and environmental information. For those trained, the chants are more than songs. They are maps, calendars, and warnings rolled into rhythm and melody. This dual purpose allows knowledge to survive quietly even when formal teaching is interrupted. Modern voyages reconnect islands socially as well. People visit relatives, reinforce political and social ties, and renew ceremonial responsibilities. Navigation is not only practical, it is relational. Canoes are literally moving threads in a web of connection, linking communities across thousands of miles of ocean. preparation for these voyages is meticulous. Food, water, and emergency equipment are accounted for. Weather forecasts are consulted, but the journey relies primarily on observation. Crew members must remain disciplined. Every action, paddling, adjusting sails, scanning the horizon, is deliberate and contributes to collective survival and success. Participation shapes character. Crew members learn humility, patience, and attentiveness. They learn to trust experience over ego, observation over assumption, and collective wisdom over individual impulse. Navigators repeatedly emphasize calmness. Panic is discouraged because it interferes with perception. Leadership is practiced quietly, distributed across the group rather than concentrated in a single voice. Voyages also reinforce adaptability. Conditions change daily, sometimes hourly. The navigator must adjust, recalibrate, and teach the crew to respond appropriately. Mistakes become learning opportunities. This approach mirrors historical practices. Ancient navigators rarely dramatized error. Instead, they quietly corrected course, integrating observation with memory, social coordination, and shared experience. Finally, these journeys are a reminder that knowledge endures not because it is documented or validated externally, but because it works. For centuries, Polynesian navigation persisted despite colonization, missionary interference, and widespread skepticism from outsiders. Knowledge survived in practice, in story, in observation, and in calm, patient repetition. Modern voyages are the living proof that continuity persists when attention is disciplined and practice is constant. As the canoe glides through morning swells, stars fading in the dawn light, birds flying overhead, and the horizon stretching endlessly, the crew moves not to prove themselves, not to claim glory, but to participate. Participation, after all, is the core of this tradition. Knowledge flows quietly from one generation to the next, ensuring that the vast Pacific remains navigable, social ties remain strong, and culture remains alive. Chapter 14: Quiet Lessons from the Ocean and Stars. Polynesian navigation offers more than technical skill. It is also a lesson in perception, patience, and humility. These lessons are subtle, almost imperceptible, but they accumulate over time, much like the swell patterns that carry a canoe across thousands of miles. The first lesson is attention. A navigator notices everything: the tilt of the waves, the direction of birds, the subtle change in cloud formation, the rising and setting of stars. Each observation matters. A moment of inattention can shift course by miles. And yet, the act of noticing is quiet. There are no alarms, no dramatic gestures. Just calm, continuous observation. This attention builds patience. Voyages take days, weeks, sometimes months. Decisions are not rushed. Timing is essential. A misstep can be corrected, but only slowly and carefully. Navigators learn to wait, to pause, to allow the natural rhythms of ocean and sky to guide them. In a modern world that prizes speed and urgency, this is a surprisingly radical practice. Humility is another key lesson. The ocean does not respond to pride or force. Stars, swells, and winds operate on their own schedules. Knowledge is not about dominating the environment, it is about participating with it. Navigators are reminded daily that skill is only effective when aligned with the rhythms of the natural world. This is a sharp contrast to the heroic narratives often told about exploration elsewhere, where conquest and risk are glorified. Chapter 16: Memory, Oral Tradition, and the Transmission of Knowledge. Polynesian navigation survives not only in practice but in memory. Centuries of voyages, observations, and careful attention are preserved through oral traditions, chants, stories, and genealogies that encode precise environmental knowledge. These traditions are subtle and patient, just like the navigation itself. Chants serve multiple functions. They are mnemonic devices, teaching stars, swells, winds, and currents through rhythm and repetition. They are also stories, embedding cultural values and ethical guidance. When a navigator recites a chant, it is not a performance. It is an active rehearsal of skill and observation. Every pause, every intonation, carries meaning that aids memory. Storytelling reinforces practical knowledge. Tales of past voyages recount decisions made at sea, the signs that indicated land, and the adjustments needed for changing conditions. While these stories may include elements of humor or drama, their core purpose is instruction. Each story is a case study, a record of problem-solving passed from elder to learner. Genealogies also encode navigational knowledge. Certain lineages are linked to particular islands, winds, or seasonal patterns. Remembering one's ancestry is, in this context, also remembering the environment. Names, sequences, and relationships are intertwined with location, timing, and observation. This dual function ensures that cultural and practical knowledge are inseparable. Memory alone is insufficient without repetition. Voyages, practice sessions, and daily observation reinforce what is learned through stories and chants. Knowledge is embodied. It is felt, seen, and enacted, not just recited. Mistakes during practice are quietly noted, corrected, and integrated into memory. This ongoing feedback loop keeps knowledge alive and reliable. Oral traditions also ensure flexibility. Written systems can become rigid, oral systems adapt. Chants evolve subtly over generations, incorporating new observations, environmental changes, or lessons learned from failed voyages. This adaptability is part of the reason Polynesian navigation has persisted despite centuries of disruption. Knowledge remains functional, not fossilized. Elders play a critical role in transmission. They guide learners patiently, correcting errors without spectacle or judgment. The emphasis is on internalizing observation, rhythm, and practice rather than on testing or display. This apprenticeship model builds competence slowly but deeply. It prioritizes understanding over performance. Stories also transmit ethical principles. Voyaging is not merely about reaching a destination. It is about responsibility to the ocean, the canoe, the crew, and the knowledge itself. Chants and tales reinforce calm, patience, humility, and relational awareness. They teach that mastery involves trust, observation, and cooperation, not ego or haste. The integration of memory, story, and practice ensures that knowledge is both durable and active. It is preserved without formal documentation. It remains functional across generations. And it continues to teach subtly, quietly shaping the character and perception of every navigator who engages with it. Even in modern revival voyages, these oral traditions are central. Navigators recite chants during preparation, training, and actual voyaging. Younger crew members learn not only the technical content but the rhythm, pauses, and emphasis embedded in the tradition. Learning is holistic, cognitive, sensory, and relational. Memory and oral tradition also provide resilience. When instruments fail, when weather changes unexpectedly, or when crew fatigue sets in, these traditions guide action. They are living systems designed to be reliable, adaptable, and effective even under stress. In this way, Polynesian navigation demonstrates a principle that extends beyond the ocean. Knowledge survives when it is lived, practiced, and remembered relationally. It does not need to be written down or celebrated to endure. Its value lies in its function, its continuity, and its quiet integration into daily life. As the canoe moves steadily under a starry sky, chants softly echo across the deck. The navigator's memory guides adjustments in the swell. The crew responds in rhythm. Knowledge, preserved for centuries, operates seamlessly in real time, connecting past, present, and future. Chapter 17. Navigating challenges through memory and observation. Even the most skilled navigators face unexpected conditions at sea. Swells shift, winds change, clouds obscure the sky, and birds vanish from view. Yet Polynesian navigation has persisted for centuries precisely because its systems, memory, observation, and oral tradition are designed to handle uncertainty calmly and reliably. During long voyages, navigators rely on memory not as a rigid script but as a living guide. Star paths are recalled in sequence, swells are interpreted through prior experience, and cloud formations are matched with known patterns. Each observation is compared to mental models developed over years of practice and encoded in chants, stories, and direct instruction from elders. When conditions are difficult, the navigator's role is subtle but vital. Adjustments are made gradually. A slight tilt of the canoe, a minor course correction, a shift in paddle rhythm, all are informed by memory and ongoing observation. Crew members are guided quietly, absorbing lessons without fanfare. Panic is absent because attention, not reaction, is emphasized. Unexpected environmental changes provide practical tests of this knowledge. For example, if a storm alters swell patterns, navigators recall similar past experiences and anticipate how the ocean will behave. Observation and memory converge. What was learned from stories or previous voyages informs decisions in real time. Mistakes are corrected gently, reinforcing learning rather than creating fear or blame. Birds and marine life remain critical indicators. Their sudden disappearance or arrival can signal weather changes, ocean currents, or proximity to land. Navigators teach the crew to interpret these signs patiently. Even when modern instruments are available, reliance on these natural cues ensures resilience and continuity of traditional knowledge. Oral traditions continue to support practical decision-making. Chants recount voyages where particular swells or stars indicated danger, land, or safe passages. These stories are rehearsed and internalized before, during, and after voyages. When conditions become challenging, recalling these narratives guides action calmly, reliably, and collectively. The psychological effect of this system is significant. Crew members, even under stress, are trained to observe rather than panic. Attention is distributed across the group. Experience and knowledge are shared. Each individual understands their role, not just in paddling, but in sensing, recording, and responding to subtle environmental cues. Modern navigators report that challenging conditions enhance learning. Every misjudgment or unexpected shift becomes an opportunity to refine observation and memory. Over time, repetition builds intuition, allowing subtle signals, changes in swell, subtle shifts in wind, or bird behavior, to be detected almost unconsciously. This system also cultivates humility. The ocean does not negotiate. The stars and winds do not respond to ego. Knowledge is useful only when applied patiently, attentively, and collectively. Success depends on relational awareness, coordination with the crew, trust in shared knowledge, and responsiveness to the environment. Even in modern revival voyages, these principles are emphasized. Navigators demonstrate to students and crew how memory, observation, and oral tradition work together. They model calm responses, deliberate adjustments, and patient teaching. Mistakes are expected but not dramatized. Each challenge reinforces the effectiveness of the living system of knowledge. In practice, this means that long voyages, sometimes weeks without sight of land, are navigated safely and effectively, not because of technology, but because attention, memory, and observation are trained to function seamlessly together. The canoe, crew, and navigator operate as a single, responsive organism, guided by centuries of embedded wisdom. As the canoe drifts across open water, swells rolling steadily beneath, and stars tracing predictable arcs overhead, every action, every paddle stroke, every observation, every subtle adjustment is informed by this quiet system. Challenges are managed calmly. Learning is continuous. Knowledge continues its unbroken journey from one generation to the next. Chapter 18. Navigation as a framework for cultural identity and community. Polynesian navigation is not simply a set of techniques for moving across the ocean. It is a living framework that shapes cultural identity, community cohesion, and intergenerational responsibility. Each voyage reinforces connections between people, place, and history in ways that are subtle, continuous, and profoundly enduring. Communities see navigators as custodians, not celebrities. Their expertise links generations. Elders pass knowledge through practice, chants, and stories. Young learners internalize this guidance, learning both skill and ethos. Success is measured not in speed or recognition, but in continuity, the ability to maintain practice, relationships, and awareness across space and time. Voyaging reinforces relational responsibility. Crew members depend on one another to maintain rhythm, observe environmental cues, and respond to subtle changes. Every individual's attention matters, every action contributes. Hierarchy is minimized in favor of distributed expertise and collective responsibility. The canoe itself becomes a microcosm of community, demonstrating that coordinated, calm effort produces results more reliably than individual heroics. Cultural identity is strengthened through repeated engagement with the ocean. Each journey retraces ancestral routes, reaffirming connections to islands, communities, and ancestors. Names of stars, swells, and clouds carry stories of past voyages, ancestors' decisions, and lessons learned over generations. Participating in these journeys situates individuals within a living historical narrative, bridging past and present. The social rhythm of voyaging mirrors cultural values. Patience, humility, and attention are practiced collectively. Mistakes are quietly corrected. Leadership emerges from observation and guidance, not assertion or ego. Young learners experience firsthand that knowledge is relational and enduring, not competitive or performative. Voyaging also preserves and transmits language, ritual, and story. Chants encode navigational knowledge, but they also reinforce cultural practices, ethical norms, and social cohesion. Reciting a chant is both a practical exercise and a reaffirmation of shared identity. In this way, navigation is inseparable from the broader cultural fabric. The continuity of these practices fosters resilience. Communities retain knowledge despite historical disruptions, colonization, cultural suppression, and environmental change. Knowledge is not solely written, it is lived, repeated, and embodied. Even dormant practices can be revived because the social and relational structures remain intact. Modern programs that teach traditional navigation highlight the same principles. Students learn stars, swells, and clouds, but they also learn responsibility, cooperation, and connection. Voyaging becomes a living lesson in both skill and identity, demonstrating that cultural continuity is sustained through practice, attention, and relational engagement rather than documentation alone. This framework extends beyond the canoe. The principles of observation, patience, humility, and collaboration inform community decision-making, education, and environmental stewardship. People learn to pay attention, act deliberately, and value collective wisdom. Knowledge that is both practical and cultural guides everyday life as well as long oceanic journeys. The ocean remains central. It is the classroom, the testing ground, and the medium through which knowledge flows. Swells, winds, stars, and wildlife continue to guide navigators. But their significance is not only technical. They anchor identity, connect communities, and sustain memory. Attention to the ocean becomes attention to lineage, history, and ethical practice. As the canoe glides over steady swells, crew and navigator move in quiet coordination. Observation, memory, and oral tradition converge. Every adjustment, every glance, every chant reinforces both practical competence and cultural belonging. Knowledge is alive, relational, and enduring. Chapter 19. Intergenerational Learning and the Cultivation of Responsibility. One of the most remarkable aspects of Polynesian navigation is its role in shaping the next generation. Knowledge is not simply handed down. It is lived, observed, and internalized through participation. Every voyage becomes a lesson in responsibility, awareness, and community. Young learners often start with small tasks, observing swells, identifying star positions, noting wind direction, or keeping watch for birds. These are modest responsibilities, but each is essential. Even small mistakes carry lessons, corrected quietly by elders or the navigator. Through repetition and gentle guidance, these observations become instinctual. Apprenticeship is relational. Elders do not lecture, they model, correct, and demonstrate. Patience is cultivated as learners repeat tasks over days, weeks, and voyages. Humility is reinforced when mistakes are addressed without drama, reminding young navigators that mastery is a process, not a performance. Responsibility is both individual and collective. Each crew member contributes to the safety, direction, and rhythm of the canoe. One person's inattention can affect the entire journey, reinforcing the importance of attentiveness and cooperation. This distributed accountability teaches that knowledge and action are inseparable from relationships.